Thank you. I'd like to call the policy meeting to order. It's Tuesday, December 19th. It's 5:35, and we are in the North Boardroom tonight. We're not in admin. So this was 5:35. Van Twyver's here. Miss O'Hensey?
Here?
Mr. Mosier?
I'm here.
Mr. Hallowell may arrive late. Miss Fitzpatrick is here. Dr. Mosley is here. And then we have the board president, Mr. Farrington's also here. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have three things on our agenda tonight. We have the psychology policy that was proposed a while back by Ms. O'Hensey to discuss. We have JBAA-R, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual violence student appendix. And then we have policy 3440.1, maintaining disclosure of and disposition of student cumulative records. Proposed policy JRA, access to student records, FERPA. Okay, so let's start with the psychology policy. Ms. O'Hensey has passed out an annotated update of her proposal. She says it's got just clarification and typos changed, fixed, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's pretty similar to the original copy. It's just that there were a few things that came up, and we didn't have one in our packet, so I thought I might as well put in those changes and make sure I printed it out so everybody's got a copy.
Ms. Van Twyver, I have a question.
Yes.
My understanding is that the packets are due at a certain time and that we're not allowed to bring things to the table after the packets have been distributed. So I'm just wondering about the additional information that Mrs. O'Hensey supplied to us.
Well, that's true. It's
I'm
supposed
just-
to be, it's
it's
supposed
a-
to hit the packet, and it's supposed to be done by 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. But she says it's only clarification stuff, so if this will be posted with the minutes for the January policy meeting. Okay. Thank you for bringing that up, but
You know, if I may,
yes,
if
Mr. Mosher.
the changes are made in any significant way, we cannot vote on that. But we'll have to put that off until a specific time, because I have not got a copy of it.
Oh, that's
I have
right.
the old copy, and I cannot access it by electronic means because of the disability I have with the computer and my ISP.
Well, we're going to continue on. This probably won't be settled tonight anyways, the psychology. It'll be brought up again probably in January. So that will go in, we'll just make sure that goes in the new packet.
Okay.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
May I speak?
Yes, sure.
Okay, we met with a psychologist, Ms. Fitzpatrick and myself, on Thursday at 2:30. So there were no changes prior to that I could have made. I mean, I didn't put it in at 9 a.m. because we didn't meet with them till 2:30. I would have left it at the old, I mean, we can go by the old one, but it wasn't in the packet. There was 0 in the packet. So I just printed out something, so we
I
had,
had it in my pack. You mean your
my
old-
packet on Friday did not have a copy.
of the old proposal?
No, well,
Mine
yours
did.
might have, mine didn't. So then it was my misunderstanding, and we can go with the old one. It's fine with me. Because I've got a copy of that here too. And really, that's not the issue. I mean, and we're not making a motion on this tonight. I just thought we'd have some discussion. I've got the old copy. I mean, there's just very few changes that were made. None of them substantive. Some of them edits, correct spelling changes and things like that, highlighting. But I think what I learned was the administration is pretty much opposed to this. They feel that they've got a lot of duties. They don't see how they can fit this in, and they don't see it as necessary. But I'd like to point out that if you're an identified student, you have to have written consent. Your parent has to be notified, and there has to be a signature on it. So we're talking those students are already notified, and the parents have given consent. It's only the unidentified students that that don't have any contact with the district if their kids are pulled from the classroom. So my concern is that they should be treated equitably. When you go to a doctor, you get advice. You don't necessarily have to follow it. You can get a second opinion. But if you don't know your child's been pulled out, then you don't even know that you should be seeking a second opinion. And you don't even know, I mean, there's a liability factor. Not all homes are stable. And the best well-meaning psychologist, I mean, there could be problems with the student that are the aftermath of a conversation that we don't anticipate. So that's why parents should be notified. It's just a precaution. If you're in private practice, the parent's always notified. When you get in a school building, suddenly there's no notification necessary. And the case that I had brought up to them wasn't even an emergency situation. I'm proposing something that just says written consent is required, and the log is for emergencies. You know, so if you know you're going to pull a child by name, you send an email, you contact the parent, you get their okay, or notify them something. The log that I proposed in here is only for those emergency situations where you can't get a hold of the parent for some reason, they're incommunicado, and we keep a log and find out after the fact just to make sure that they were notified. So, I mean, that's the proposal, and I'm concerned about liability. I think that if we don't notify parents, at some point there may be a problem, and then we've exposed ourselves.
Mr. Kaufman?
You know, there's a number of things in this, because I'm going for the old unedited thing now, and I've read it through, and I found a number of things that have led me to be very disconcerted about some of the things and the way it's expressed here, and I feel that is exposure of the identities of the children or the students that are at odds here, away from the law that the FERPA has put on, and I would not consider this even in any way to pass the bill, because these things are, still in this. So I would, respectfully ask that this entire affair be put off until, January sometime, because at least I think I'll be able to attend in person and go over this and state my concerns because of the identities of the students that would be exposed.
Thank you, Bill. Mr. Kaufman, would you give me just a minute? Usually we start off with administration and hear this side of it, and then we'll take your question. Okay?
Sure.
I just wanted to comment on the meeting that we had the other day. Really, the purpose of the meeting was to share the big packet of information that Mark Leclerc had provided that really is the guidelines for the American Psychologists Association and school psychologists. So there was a lot of informational text for the board to be able to look at and hopefully clarify the role of a school psychologist versus outside of school psychologists, and hopefully to clarify what the role of psychologists is. I think that it was clear at the meeting that the concern expressed was that if there was an individual student issue and we didn't have the ability to address it because the parent would not communicate with the school and the principal so that we could rectify anything that had gone wrong, there was really no way to address the issue. I think that we had good conversation at our meeting, but I don't think that we came to any resolution, but in particular, there was no questions about the packet of information that Mark and his psychologist had put together for information. And so I want to reiterate that a lot of work and time went into this packet of information to help the board understand better the role of psychologists in school. And I hope that there's any questions about the packet that we will find out what those questions are, because we truly do feel that the ethical standards that our psychologists work under are the necessary criteria we need, not this policy in particular. And Doris is correct. The administration, Christine Breen, who is the supervisor for Mark Leclerc, and Mark Leclerc, who is the head psychologist, and I don't support this policy.
Okay, I have one question. The letter to the members of the policy committee that's dated September 22nd, there was the best practice guidelines of the Nashua School Psychology Department. Is this brand new, or has this been around for a while, and they updated it, or do you know?
It's the most updated version.
Okay.
And it was supplied by Mark Leclerc.
Okay, so this is your administration procedure.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Coffin.
Thank you. I went through this information, and I have a whole bunch of questions. And to Mr. Mosier's point about a full discussion, I completely agree. However, just to Ms. Van Twyver's point here, if you look at the first paragraph of that September 22nd memo, in the third sentence where it says, in response to this proposed policy, the group of psychologists offers the following best practice guidelines for Nashua school psychologists, along with supporting documentation. So I would ask the administration to check on their source, because the way I read this paragraph, as I think Ms. Twyver's question indicated, it appeared to me that this was a first offer. I won't go into all my questions, because I think that should occur when we have the chance to dive deep in this. But I would ask that Mr. Leclerc be here for that meeting to respond directly. I'm kind of disappointed that he's not here tonight. The board's business, we have a lot to do. Board members come prepared to discuss these things, and if someone sends an email, provides a report with 3 appendices and everything else and doesn't come to the meeting and just thinks they're going to punt, I think that's totally inconsiderate. Now, so clarification on when the best practice guide was actually created, because to me, like I said, it feels like it's a new document. And I do want to just say I have several questions, but one of my main concerns is declaring ethics from a third-party organization. To me, ethics are a personal thing. And always accepting what somebody else's ethical standard is without kind of having your own filter on it really creates a problem for me. And I will point out that in the Principles for Professional Ethics on page 4 of one of the attachments, it doesn't have an appendix 1, 2, or 3, but I think it was 2. One of their standards says on page 4, section, it looks like an I.1.2 is the lower left-hand corner of that page. It is ethically permissible to provide psychological assistance without parent notice or consent in emergency situations, or if there is reason to believe a student may pose a danger to others, is at risk for self-harm, or is in danger of injury, exploitation, or maltreatment. I'm not going to go deeper than just pointing this out and say, at what planet does this make sense that a parent is left out of the loop? I'll defer my other comments to our next meeting. There was one other thing. Oh, I do have a question, and this goes to governance. Dr. Mosley, Appendix 3, Nashua Public School District Assessment of Suicidal Risk Documents. Back in, I'm going to guess it was around May I don't think it was in June, I think it was in May of 2016, when Mr. Conrad was here and we learned that he was leaving. At that time, I had asked for a list of all the administrative procedures that the district had. I did not receive that list until I filed a right-to-know request in August of 2016, the week that Mr. Conrad left. I gave it to him on Monday, and by Friday, I had what turned out to be a very partial list of procedures. So then again, in October, I got some more information with the help of Dr. Brown. This particular document, Appendix III or 3, whatever it is, which has a date of July 2011, was not given in response to that right-to-know request for procedures in the district. Now, I understand Dr. Mosley, thank you, Fitzpatrick, were not in the district at that time, but the people who were the director at that time were here, as was, I guess, Mr. Leclerc, and I have a problem that a legitimate right to know, well, first of all, a request from the board member was not fulfilled in a timely manner, that such a right to know request. So I need to know now, and maybe you need to do some more checking, if there are any other administrative procedures in the special ed department in general and other departments in particular, that there's some floating out there that have not been given in that response to that right to know. And I would like to have that information in a short order, perhaps for our next board meeting. And if there are documents, I ask that they be provided at that time. And if necessary, I will file a second right-to-know request for the information, as I now know it's been unfulfilled. And I'm very upset about that, because this is an old document. It's not like that best practices, which he said, I believe, is a new document. I'll stop there, Mr. Tarver. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Farrington, and let the record show that Mr. Hallowell arrived at 5:50.
I'm going to pass. You guys are going to decide this next year. No sense taking time.
Mrs. Van Twyne?
Yep, excuse me, Dr. Mosley and then Ms. Johansson.
Mr. Kaufman, I just have some questions and clarity on what you're looking for in terms of procedure. For the next board meeting, are you looking, it'd be helpful to know exactly, perhaps giving us an email, exactly your request for procedures in terms of special education, and we can certainly provide that. For the next board meeting, I don't know to what extent we're going to be looking for documents. So just for clarification purposes, it would be helpful for the team to know exactly what you're looking for, but also be sensitive to the fact that for the next board meeting, we're going to be seating new board members. And there's going to be some procedural pieces that are going to happen. And to jumping into something of this magnanimous, given that we're going to be smack dab in the middle of budget season, we've got a number of negotiations going on. So I'd like to make a recommendation to prioritize some of the challenges that we are facing with the new board coming in.
Mr. Kaufman?
Thank you. And thank you for reminding me that the January 8th, which is our next board meeting, is an organizational meeting, which I doubt we'll have any other business other than that. So your point is well taken and absolutely agreed to. My concern is that information requested in a legitimate way, I mean, you're not party to that. So what I'll be happy to do is forward to you my original right-to-know request and ask that you, now that you're in place and you've got 6 months under your belt, that you respond to that. And I think this particular document would be one of those documents that would now come forward. And I'll copy it to you as an email, not a formal right-to-know request, which in New Hampshire has a 5-day response time. So in deference to that.
Thank you.
But perhaps our first meeting in February.
Yes.
And we can get
thank
an
you.
answer back at that time if Dr. Mosley, and we can certainly talk about whatever, but.
Just clarification, there is a regular board meeting after the organizational meeting on January the 8th.
Right, understood. But to Dr. Mosley's point, we've got to get committees in place before we have to select a board chair, president, and we need to get our committees in place. So I thank him for that reminder. And in acknowledgement, I'm even saying, look, okay, let's wait until February. Let's get through January. We've got a lot, as you suggest, on our plate. So thank you very much.
Ms. O'Hensy?
Thank you. I've got a few responses to each of the previous speakers. To Mr. Mosier, if you look on the last page of the proposal, it says, "No personally identifiable information on students shall be recorded in this treatment log." It has the date, it has a grade level, but there's nothing that would tie it to the student. And if there was concern, that could be adjusted when we fine-tune the policy, because that was not the intent. To Ms. Fitzpatrick, we don't use the American Psychologists Association. We use NASP. So NASP is totally different than the APA. APA, there would be no problem, but even if you look at that section that Mr. Kaufman brought up, it's ethically permissible to provide psychological assistance without parental notice or consent in emergency situations if there's a reason to believe, et cetera, et cetera. That's consistent with my proposal. I mean, if there's an emergency, that's the exception. We don't want to endanger the child. We want to provide the service and make sure the parent's notified later. The incident that brought this whole issue to my attention was a non-emergency situation. So that was very different. And my concern is that there's equity. I mean, if you've got identified students, that they get notification and consent, the non-identified students are equally important. And if they are going to be called out of class by name, then there should be time in a non-emergency situation to contact the parent. If it's an emergency, by all means, go ahead and log it later. This proposal was not intended to in any way thwart the activities of our Department of School Psychologists. It was to work with them and get a feel for the board, to make sure that there's that notification piece. And I think just that differentiation between emergency and non-emergency will remind them, okay, this is an emergency. I can send an email to the parent. They'll send back an okay, that's not a problem, and then I can go and pull the child from the classroom, because it's not an emergency situation. And in the emergency situation, there's no way that this in any way would impede their reaction time.
May I ask you, Ms. O'Hensy, is there something that is lacking in their best practice guidelines that you would like to have added to that? That would be a good compromise, I think, between...
They don't want to use that as a policy. I'm interested to know if Dr. Mosley would consider this a district procedure. I mean, it's called best practice, but I mean, he's doing a request to get all the procedures and the protocol on suicidal risk. I mean, that seems to be a procedure. So is this new document that they came together and formed of best practices, would that be considered a procedure? I don't know.
Well, I just asked Ms. Fitzpatrick if that was the case, that it was an administrative procedure and not a policy procedure that was
Right.
they were proposing. And she said it was an administrative procedure.
Okay, I think there still needs to be clarification for parents, because the model that I used came from another area, and I think it was, and I'm willing to work with them on it, it provides an explanation of what services we provide, that they're free, and it shows that there's concern for privacy. They can opt out of it. They can, at some point stop and say, well, I'm not going to continue on this, or rework their IEP. I mean, it's clear that parents have some prerogative, and I think that's up front so that they see that. And, it's reassuring to parents that are of students that are not identified that there's a protocol or a policy whereby they know how their child's going to be treated. This one parent said to me, I've told my child not to speak with anybody outside the classroom. Like if it's to have the parent brought in. In the classroom, it's fine, but she didn't want the child being treated by a school psychologist, and she was concerned that no effort was ever made to her. Now, that's water over the dam. I just look at it as, let's prevent that from happening again. Let's not set ourselves up for a liability. I mean, this was a benign situation relatively. The parent was very irate, but if there was some adverse reaction of the student, I mean, could this lead to a liability? And I just thought this was a clean situation. Notify if there's emergency, log it, and worry about it later. I mean, log it after it. You don't even have to stop to log it, but there is a log that would track, to make sure that the parent was notified.
Well, the best practice guidelines, number 3 on the second page says, no ongoing long-term psychological service shall be provided to a student without written parental consent, except in emergency situations. Would you be amenable to adding another sentence that even on a one-time basis that the parent has to be notified?
Which page was that?
That was page 2, it's number 3 of best practices. Down at the bottom, informed consent.
Yeah. It says no ongoing long-term. That leaves, I mean, that's a nice sentiment, but it's ongoing long-term. That gives a big hole for them to have intermittent ones here and there. And then the other concern was the next page, page 3, where it said psychological services may also be ethically provided. Oh, but this is self-referred minors. Okay, I didn't get that at the first time. For up to 4 sessions without parental consent. So in the sense that it was self-referred, I guess the idea there is there may be a problem at home. I'm coming to you as a student, even though I'm a minor. And, that's understandable. The one on page 2, I don't like the ongoing long-term. Where's the definition of ongoing and long-term? I mean, this parent didn't say, well, it was only, 1 or 2 incidences, so I wasn't worried. She was immediately concerned. And I've asked other parents that have called me for other reasons. I said, by the way, what's your reaction to this situation? I haven't gotten anybody that said, oh, that's fine. Maybe a parent of an identified student and they're familiar with and they're accustomed to psychological services in the school, they don't see, it's not a big deal because they're already having a relationship. But it's the parents that don't have the relationship. They feel disrespected that no notification was made to them to initiate the relationship. And I think that's what we want to be, respectful.
Well, could we also add a sentence to this that says a one-time event with a student, the parent has to be called? I mean,
See, I don't see the harm in notifying the parent. I think the parent is a team player, except when he isn't, and then those are emergency situations where the child could be endangered, and those are legitimate. But if the parent is still a team player, you want to get all your members of the team lined up. You want to all be on the same page. So if you just say, well, we talked about this, then the parent can look out for that if there's something. Because not all these children are very verbal. I mean, some of them, they talk, but they're not self-reflective as much as a teenager would be. So it helps the parent to know this was the conversation that took place in school. So if there's any follow-up, just be on the alert.
I find it hard, though, to think that a psychologist would call in a student when they're without notifying the parent, when that's their normal procedure.
Where's that written as the normal procedure? See, that my policy, it says it's normal procedure, but I didn't get the feeling that in the best practices, notification was first on the list.
Well, anybody else have anything to say? Mr. Kaufman?
Thank you. In response to Ms. Fitzpatrick's comment earlier about this best practice document, are you asking us to provide you with proposed changes to it? I mean, I edited the document as I read it. And that's where my questions are. I can make a copy and provide that to you. It sounded as though you wanted that feedback.
In conversation with Mark Leclerc, I think that this was supposed to be an informational document to give you more information about what school psychologists do. I do want to point out on page 1, number 2, it says that this is in accordance with New Hampshire Law 306.25. So what they've written in this best practice document is aligned with the New Hampshire law.
Okay, if I may say and continue, I think there's things that could be done in this document to add clarification and for reference and reading. I won't get into the details, but that's what happens when somebody puts a document in front of me. It's what I do. I edit, I read, and I try to clarify. And there's some language in here. I'll just point out under number 3, the pages are, well, it is page 2, number 3, informed consent. For students under the age of 18 years, written consent from the student's parent or legal guardian will be ascertained. Now, I knew what the meaning was, but I did check the dictionary. It says determined or looked up or sought out. I would like to see that word obtained to be changed to obtained, because in my opinion, parents have a right to know if their student is in distress or not. And if we pull somebody out because it is an emergency, I believe they should have that. And then I have areas, instead of under number 5, confidentiality, school psychologists are required to share information with parents in the following circumstances. And I just, the share, no, I would say promptly notify parents. And these are areas where there's danger to themselves or to others or the school or whatever. So I think there's some language in here that can be tightened up. I did have a whole bunch, I mean, and to the point here, the very first paragraph of that, again, that first paragraph of the September 22nd memo says the group of psychologists offer the following best practice guidelines. So they're making an offer. And in that regard, as policy members or board members, it's a suggestion. It's a recommendation. We get to edit things if we want. For me, and I know Ms. Hoensi has gone through a lot of work here and done a lot of research on this, but at the end of the day, for me, I think this policy, and I think there should be a policy, is very simple. Parent notification is policy. And finding ways to wiggle around that, to me, is, I think it's ethically irresponsible. Again, I didn't want to get into this, so do you want to receive my comments or not?
Yes, and as I said before, Mark and the psychologist put together this packet of information, so I would take your comments and forward them to him.
That's fine. You said it was informational, so therefore I'm providing back some feedback to their document. Hopefully it'll find its way in there.
And
You know, considering that I hope there will be some kind of policy surrounding parental notification, and if we accept this best practice guides as a procedural document, then it could be part of the board policy. We could attach an R to it. So,
can I make a clarification? I just need to say on behalf of the psychologists that I don't think that they're trying to wiggle out, to quote you, of anything. I do believe that psychologists work really hard to work closely with families, and I don't think that not contacting parents is a common occurrence. It may have happened once, but I believe that the psychologists feel that they make every effort to work closely with parents because they recognize that it's the team that has the biggest impact on the child. So I just wanted to clarify that, and I'm saying it in support of the psychologists, not to disrespect anybody.
Great. Ms. Santoiver, if I may.
I have something to say on this, Bill.
Mr. Mosher, and then Mr. Kaufman, and then Ms. Hoensi.
Okay, thank you very much. You're looking at these documents. I have them right in front of me at the time, and I like the best practice guidelines of the National School Psychology Department. I think that's very well done. I think that, Mr. Kaufman had made a point there by saying that the parental notification, that part of it should be possibly as a part of the process, the policy, and also to take into some other things that we should be aware of. That sometimes the parental notification is not a good idea because sometimes the parents are part of the problem. And if that's part of the problem, then you should be very careful about notifying them because that may put other people into harm's way, especially the students, especially if there's say a son and a daughter who different grades or different aspects there. But we have to be very careful about this at the same time, because if we don't do it right, there is a legal problem that could come up, especially if the children are harmed in some way, either physically or mentally. So we have to be very careful about this. Now, psychology is not one of those things that you can fool around with and expect to put down in a few words. I think that putting it down as a notification with some explanation as the policy, but accepting as the addendum that we have here before us as the best practices guidelines. We have to look out for that too, because now we're messing there with FERPA, and we don't want to get involved with that. And especially if you start changing too many things, like with the RSAs. The RSAs are fine to use as a guideline, but you don't start changing the wording to change what you want. So we have to be very careful and go through this whole thing. I think that we have to have more study on this, and there should be at some point where we want to make a change, that we should have a legal opinion as whether or not we can do that. Because I would like, not get involved where we do something and then later on find out we made a boo-boo. Okay, so that's my thoughts on this. And I have more floating around in my head, but I don't want to take up too much time now.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you. I guess we keep coming back to this. I too had some other things I wanted to discuss. Mr. Mosier just brought up a point that I'd like to throw out for discussion. Well, what happens if the parent is the problem? So what do? I don't know that is accounted for in these discussions. Is DCYF necessarily if the kid can't go home for some reason? We are not a child care, daycare, overnight thing. So does this student get referred to DCYF? I don't know. There's no provision in this policy or these proposals. And then to Ms. Hohensy's point of liability, and thank you for reminding me. I had comments about that. My concern is the liability. If we, for some reason, pull out a non-identified student and determine that our psychologists determine that counseling is warranted, and if something tragically happens to that student during, shortly after, or the next day, in some proximity to those meetings, what is the liability of the district in that consultation without parent notification? And that terrifies me. The other part of that, and I guess I will discuss it, is it's my understanding from the budget process we get well over $1 million a year. The school district receives reimbursement. I think it's largely from Medicaid. I don't remember. Some state, George's, thank you, Mr. Farrington, I'm stating something correctly, right? Yes. So we receive well over $1 million a year as a service provider. I think it's largely through Medicaid. So in that regard, we are currently a paid service provider for the state. To that extent, I believe personally that our psychologists should meet the same criteria that any private practice psychologist, 3Ps, would be required to perform. In that regard, there are no discrepancies between the services that we provide as a service provider that we get paid for, or we do not as a service provider, but at least everything, consistency is applied. And to me, that's very important. And I think the risk assessment people at the, when Mr. Mosier mentioned the legal opinion, reminded me of my thought about a risk assessment. The city has a risk assessment office, and I know that they're involved in things like this, and I think it would be worthwhile to get their opinion on this, consistent with the liability. And, you know, that's a source of revenue to the district that we count on. And I would hate something that was a non-Medicaid related, non-IEP type service delivery to impact that. So to that extent, if you can look into those things, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Can I just,
Well said there, Mr. Kaufman. But, because we are supplying a process to this psychological thing, and it does come under the heading of medical. And you're right about the Medicaid being a thing, and that brings also the federal government into it. So there may be a lot more to this than what meets the eye just in our cursory examination of best guidelines. So there may be a whole lot more to this.
I'd just like to correct, it's not well over $1 million. Medicaid reimbursement runs right around $1 million, plus or minus a little bit, isn't it, Bob?
I remembered 1.4, but
Is it up to $2 million now? Okay, I'm
I think
sorry.
it was $1 million. We instituted a policy that they were able to, we had software put in place to make it more efficient, and that's how it got to $2 million.
I remember reading something about
DCYF?
DCYF in one of these documents.
Okay.
So somewhere there's been, I don't know whether it was yours or not.
Well, no.
What you do when, they don't have a place to go.
I think one of the documents that was provided by the psychology department points out that the district can call DCYF up to 5 p.m., and then afterwards, they call the police department. So they must have a branch or some type of service or way of connecting with an emergency group or something to take care of a child that would still be on our hands at that point. I wanted to point out that a legal opinion is great, and when we get closer to knowing what we're doing, that would be good. It's the risk management department at City Hall that might also weigh in on this. State law, there's an entire chapter on licensed psychologists under the APA. And there's an exception in this chapter, like a 2-line exception for school psychologists under the New Hampshire Department of Education, with very little written about the school psychologists. The only place that it's written is in the New Hampshire Board of Education regulations, and even there it says school psychologists are optional for a district. So there's not a lot written, and both of them rely on those ethics of the different groups, the APA for private and the NASP for school psychologists. But, in this best practice, it's informed consent chapter, on page 2, item number 3. I think that needs to be clearer. It's except in emergency situations that there is informed consent. And this, it says it'll be ascertained where it should say obtained. This should be clearer. This would work with us, and we'd work together on this if that was a little bit clearer. I'd also like to see Mr. Kaufman's notes on modifications to this best practice. And I just want equity for the identified versus not identified in terms of liability. And we've got enough liability. We don't need to ask for more by leaving ourselves exposed. So if we can nail this down, this will be good.
Anybody else? So, some action items. We need clarification on the best practices. Is it a new document or a pre-existing one? I had something about ethical parents left out of long, but I don't remember what that action item was supposed to be. Appendix number 3, not given the right by Brown. Any other admin? Oh, this was Mr. Kaufman's request to see all the procedures that were, that he hasn't seen in conjunction with psychology. But he's also going to send his right-to-know request to Dr. Mosley so that he can review that and get any other documents that Mr. Kaufman wants. Then legal opinion and on risk management, take care of that. And Mr. Kaufman is going to send you edits to the document that, best practices that he would like to see recommended, so that, that it can all be taken up in January at the policy meeting on the, I think it's the 16th or 19th. Anything else on this topic? Dr.
Yes, for me, I also would like to see Mr. Kaufman's edits on the best practices.
If you'll send it to the board, this committee.
I'll scan them and send them electronically.
Yeah, thank you.
So you have to do it a different way for me. I am not capable now of electronic transmission.
When I get it, I'll email it to you, okay?
Well,
Mr. Mosher?
he's saying he can't receive it electronically.
Yeah,
We'll
I
make
know.
sure you get a hard copy,
That's
Mr.
what I'm
Moser.
saying.
Okay, very good. I appreciate
And I'll see that he gets a copy of it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Mosley, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Just a point of clarification. When I receive Mr. Kaufman's request, I'll just share that request with the board, the entire board, and then whatever the response back, I'll share with the entire board as well.
Thank you.
And the other thing would be to bring the head psychologist to the January meeting so that they can ask them questions directly. Anything else on this topic? Okay, so the next one, if I can find my agenda, which I cannot.
Moving on.
Moving on, slowly but surely. Oh, I know what I did. Turned it over. JBAA-R, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual violence, the student appendix. So, Ms. Fitzpatrick?
This is a document that needs to be updated on a regular basis for the change in staff, the principal at each building, and the phone numbers have changed because of the upgrade to the phone system. So all this does is update the information so that the students have current, correct information in the